The Imperial station of Varicthul was not a place that made people feel welcome. It was too big for that. It hung in space like a dark mountain, orbiting a dead star that gave off no light and no warmth. The station was old, older than most civilizations currently alive, and it looked like it. Its walls were made of black stone carved from the cores of collapsed planets. Its hallways were wide enough to fit a ship inside them. The whole structure made a low, quiet hum, as if the building itself was breathing slowly in its sleep. Inside the waiting halls, dozens of alien ambassadors moved around in nervous clusters. They came from at least 12 different species, each one dressed in their finest clothes, each one carrying a gift. There were tall, silver-skinned Solari delegates who moved like water and never blinked. There were Keth ambassadors with 4 arms and dark compound eyes, each arm carrying a different ceremonial object. There were Theran representatives draped in fabric that changed color every few seconds, a sign of their wealth and importance back home. They all had one thing in common. They were all afraid. The name of Varicthul was known across the galaxy. He was the Dragon Emperor, and he had ruled his empire for over 3,000 years. No one alive had been born before his reign. No one could remember a time when he did not exist. He had watched species rise, conquer, collapse, and disappear. He had seen stars burn out. He had witnessed the birth of new civilizations and the quiet death of old ones. And through all of it, he had sat on his throne in this cold black station, and he had never, not once, accepted a gift from anyone. The list of rejected gifts was legendary. The Solari had once offered him a crown made inside a living sun, formed from solar fire and cooled into solid gold over a century of careful work. He had looked at it for 3 seconds and turned away. The Keth had brought a living Ark ship, an entire self-contained world in a vessel the size of a moon, filled with animals and plants and 1,000 years of accumulated art and history. He had let it drift into empty space without a word. The Theran had offered him a garden world, a whole planet, with rivers and mountains and clean air, completely untouched by industry. He had sent it into a nearby black hole. Not with anger. With complete indifference. Everyone in the waiting hall knew this history. It was the reason they were all so quiet. The human delegation arrived late and slightly out of breath. There were 3 of them: Grace Holloway, the lead ambassador, who walked quickly and kept her expression calm even though she was clearly nervous; Pete Dunbar, her assistant, who kept checking his jacket pocket for a piece of paper he had already read 40 times, and Leon Voss, the cultural attaché, who had the specific look of a man who had made a terrible mistake and was only now beginning to understand how terrible it was. Behind them, pulling a worn blue backpack on one shoulder, was a small boy named Danny Colt. He was 10 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and sneakers that had seen better days. He was looking around the waiting hall with wide eyes and his mouth slightly open, not because he was scared, but because he genuinely found everything fascinating. Danny was not supposed to be there. He was Grace's ward, a boy she had taken in after his parents died in a colony accident 2 years before. The plan had always been to leave him with a neighbor back home, but the mission timeline had changed 3 times, and the audience with the Emperor had been confirmed only 8 days before departure, and in the chaos of getting everything ready, Grace had simply run out of time to make other arrangements. She had brought him along with strict instructions to stay quiet, stay close, and not touch anything that he was already touching. The wall. Danny, Grace said quietly, and he pulled his hand back without looking embarrassed. The other delegations noticed the humans arrive. A few of the Keth ambassadors turned their compound eyes toward them with something between curiosity and amusement. One of the Solari representatives, a tall individual whose real name was unpronounceable, leaned toward a colleague and said something in a low voice that made the other one produce a sound like a polite laugh. A Keth ambassador, who spoke the common trade language well enough, drifted over to Grace and introduced himself as Coordinator Van Hale of the 3rd Trading Cluster. He was not unkind, exactly, but he had the manner of someone delivering unfortunate news. "I see your delegation has arrived," he said. "I hope your journey was comfortable." He paused. "I also hope you do not feel pressure to present a gift. Given the limitations of your species' current resources, it might be better for everyone if you simply attended." Grace kept her expression neutral. "Thank you for the advice," she said. Van Hale nodded in a way that suggested he genuinely meant to be helpful. Then he drifted back to his own group. Pete leaned in close to Grace. "He's not wrong," he said under his breath. "We don't have anything to give, I know," Grace said. "So what do? We go in, we say what we came to say, we leave." Pete looked like he wanted to ask something else but stopped himself. Leon was staring at the floor and looked like he might need to sit down. Danny, meanwhile, had found a seat on a stone bench near the far wall and had already taken out his sketchbook. He was drawing the hall around him, the high ceiling, the alien ambassadors, the strange angular shapes of the architecture. His colored pencils were arranged on the bench beside him in a neat row by color. He was completely calm. He was the only person in the room who was. The doors to the throne hall were made of something that was not quite metal and not quite stone. They were dark, almost black, and they were so tall that the top of them disappeared into the shadows above. When they opened, they did not make a sound. They simply moved, slow and heavy and absolute, like the doors had decided on their own to let someone through. Each delegation was called in one at a time. The wait between each one was long. Sometimes there was a sound from inside the hall, a low voice, a silence, something that might have been the scrape of stone on stone. Once, there was a brief flash of cold blue light that came from under the doors and then vanished. No one commented on it. The Solari went in first. They came out 10 minutes later looking the same way they always looked, which was calm and unbothered, but Grace watched their hands carefully and their fingers were moving in small patterns at their sides, which she had read was a sign of suppressed distress in their species. Their crown had not come back out with them. The Keth delegation went in next and came out in 4 minutes. One of Van Hale's colleagues was missing the object he had been carrying in his second left arm. He did not look at anyone when he walked back to their waiting area. The Theron took 7 minutes. When they returned, 2 of them were not changing colors anymore. Their fabric sat flat and gray, which in their culture meant something that translated roughly as stunned silence. Each delegation settled back into the waiting area and said nothing. There was no comparing notes, no quiet conversations about what had happened inside. They simply stood or sat and waited for the rest of the audiences to end. Danny looked up from his sketchbook each time a delegation came back out. He watched them carefully, the way a child watches something that interests them, without judgment, just attention. Then he went back to drawing. He had moved on from sketching the hall. He was working on something else now, bent low over the page, his blue pencil moving in careful, deliberate lines. By the time the last major delegation before the humans had returned from inside, a group of Velesi, who communicated by color changes in their skin and who came out looking almost entirely white, which Grace had been told was the Velesi equivalent of shock, the hall had gone very quiet. There were perhaps 20 beings in the waiting area now and none of them were speaking. Grace checked the time. Their turn was next. She straightened her jacket. She looked at Pete, who nodded. She looked at Leon, who swallowed. She turned to the bench where Danny was sitting. "Danny," she said. "We're going in. Stay right next to me." "Okay," Danny said. He tucked his sketchbook into his backpack and zipped it halfway. He gathered his pencils and put them back in their tin. Then he stood up and fell into step beside her, his backpack over one shoulder. The doors opened again. The throne hall was enormous. That was the first thing. It was not just large in the way that big rooms were large, it was large in the way that open sky is large, where the size of it stopped being a measurement and started being a feeling. The ceiling was so far above them that the top of it was in actual darkness. The walls on either side were carved with shapes and patterns that took a moment to understand were not decorations but records, names and events and dates carved into stone in a dozen different scripts, covering every surface from floor to where the eye could not follow. At the far end of the hall, on a throne that looked like it had grown out of the floor rather than been built on it, sat Varric Thol. He was larger than anything that had ever frightened Grace Holloway in her life, and she had been frightened by a number of things. He sat perfectly still, which somehow made him more intimidating than if he had been moving. His scales were the color of deep space between stars, not black, exactly, but the color that exists beyond black, where light stops meaning anything. His wings were folded behind him and they were large enough that even folded they reached the sides of the throne and extended past it. His eyes were open and they were gold, not warm gold but the gold of something very old and very cold that had simply stopped changing that he was looking at them. Grace walked forward. Her footsteps were quiet on the stone floor. Pete and Leon followed a step behind her. Danny walked beside her, his sneakers making a small squeak with each step that echoed slightly in the enormous space. Grace stopped at the appropriate distance, which she had memorized from the protocol documents, and she spoke. She had prepared her words carefully. She talked about humanity's gratitude for the audience. She talked about the recent border conflict evacuation, where human ships had helped pull civilians from the path of a collapsing trade route, and how she hoped this demonstrated that humanity was a species that valued cooperation. She talked about hope for future communication and mutual understanding. She said nothing about wanting anything. She had been very deliberate about that. When she finished, she waited. Varicthol looked at her. He had not moved during her speech. He did not move now. The silence stretched out and became its own kind of presence, filling the hall the way water fills a space, finding every corner. Grace held very still. Beside her, she could feel Pete barely breathing. The silence was about to become a dismissal. She could feel it. The Emperor's gaze had not shifted, but there was something in the quality of his stillness that said the conversation was over, that they should turn around and walk back out, that nothing had happened here and nothing would. Then she heard the squeak of sneakers on stone. She did not have time to react. Danny had already moved. He walked straight across the floor of the throne hall, his small figure crossing the vast empty space between the human delegation and the Emperor's throne, his backpack bouncing once on his shoulder. He did not run. He walked the way children walk when they have decided to do something and have not yet considered whether it might be a bad idea. He stopped in front of the Emperor and looked up. Behind him, Grace had gone so still she might have turned to stone herself. Pete's hand was halfway out but had not reached anything. Leon appeared to have stopped functioning entirely. Danny reached into his backpack. The thing that Danny Colt pulled out of his backpack was a piece of paper. It was not a large piece of paper. It was folded in half, the size of a greeting card, which is exactly what it was. One corner was slightly bent from being in the bag. The paper itself was ordinary, the kind that came in packs of 500 from a supply store and was used for homework and printing and writing lists. It was not special paper. It had not been made by craftsmen or blessed by priests or treated with anything that might make it remarkable. Danny held it up in both hands, the way a child offers something they have made, without any embarrassment or apology for what it is. The front of the card had a drawing on it. The drawing was done in colored pencil, dark blue, black, gray, and silver, and it showed a figure sitting on a throne. The figure had wings and scales and an ancient, careful quality that managed to look both enormous and somehow still. Around the figure, small careful stars had been drawn in silver pencil, not perfectly round, more like the way stars look when a child draws them from memory, six-pointed, a little uneven, placed with thought rather than accuracy. It was, unmistakably, a drawing of Varicthol. The hall was silent. Grace was not sure she was still breathing. She was not sure anyone was. The Emperor looked down at the card. He was so much larger than Danny that the distance between them seemed impossible, the way the distance between a mountain and a stone at its base seems impossible. And yet Danny was standing there with his arms up, holding the card at the full extent of his reach, patient, waiting. Varicthol reached down. He moved slowly and with great care, which was strange to watch in something so large. He took the card between two clawed fingers and held it up, tilting it slightly toward what little light existed in the hall. He looked at the front. He opened it. Inside, in the uneven but careful handwriting of a 10-year-old who had been told more than once to slow down and press harder with the pencil, it said, "Thank you for letting us come here. I know you are very busy and very old and probably tired of everyone wanting things from you. I just wanted to say thank you." From Danny Colt, age 10, Earth, there was a small drawing in the bottom corner of the inside as well, a round shape that was probably meant to be a planet, with a tiny stick figure standing on it and one arm raised in a wave. Nobody in the throne hall spoke. Nobody moved. The alien ambassadors who were still in the waiting area outside could not see through the closed doors, but later they would say that around that moment, the low hum of the station seemed to change pitch very slightly, so briefly that most of them thought they had imagined it. Varicthol read the card again. Then he looked at Danny. Danny looked back at him. He did not look frightened. He looked the way he always looked when he was waiting to find out if he had done something right, a little hopeful, a little unsure, but not afraid. The Emperor spoke. His voice was low and deep, and it moved through the hall the way a sound moves through deep water, reaching every surface before it faded. He spoke in the common trade language, not because he needed to, he knew every language that had ever existed in his empire, but because he understood that the boy would need to understand him. The stars, he said. You drew them wrong. Danny looked at the card in the Emperor's hand, then back up at him. I know, he said. I've never seen them up close. I drew them how I think they look. There was a pause. How do you think they look? The Emperor asked. Danny thought about it for a second. Pointy, he said. Like they're trying to be noticed. Something happened in the Emperor's expression that was difficult to name. It was not a smile. He had not smiled in a very long time, and the shape of it was not what that word described. It was more like a small movement in something that had been completely stilled. He looked at the card again. Then he set it down carefully on the arm of his throne, not dropped, not placed with indifference, but set down with the specific deliberateness of someone who does not want a thing to fall. Grace found that she had taken a step forward without meaning to. She stopped herself. The Emperor looked at Danny for a long moment. Then he looked at Grace. His gaze moved across Pete and Leon, who both appeared to be managing their reactions with varying degrees of success. Then he looked back at Danny. You drew this yourself, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Danny said. I was drawing in the waiting room. I was going to draw you anyway because you seemed interesting. And then I thought you probably don't get many thank you cards. So I made it a card. Another pause. Longer this time. You are correct, the Emperor said. I do not. Danny nodded, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. That seems lonely, he said, in the direct way that children say things that adults would spend 10 minutes finding a careful way not to say. The hall was absolutely quiet. Grace was fairly certain she was about to faint. She was equally certain that Pete had stopped breathing entirely somewhere around the moment Danny said the word lonely to the most powerful and ancient being in the known galaxy, but Varric did not look angry. He did not look offended. He looked at Danny with those cold gold eyes, and the expression on his face was something that had not been there a few minutes ago, something that did not have a simple name in any language Grace knew, but that looked, from where she was standing, like recognition, like something sleeping had opened one eye. The Emperor's hand rested beside the card on the arm of his throne. He did not pick it up again, but his fingers were near it, in the way that a person stays near something without meaning to. Your delegation may go, he said. His voice was the same as before, deep and even and old. You will receive notice tomorrow morning. Notice of what? He did not say. They turned and walked back toward the doors. Grace kept her pace even and controlled until she was almost at the exit, and then she put her hand on Danny's shoulder, gently but firmly, and kept it there for the rest of the walk. Danny looked up at her. Did I do okay? He asked. Grace looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said quietly. I think you did. Behind them, in the great silent hall, the card sat on the arm of the Emperor's throne, slightly crumpled at one corner, with its crayon stars that were not quite right pointing in all directions like they were trying to be noticed. The notification arrived at the human delegation's quarters early the next morning, while Grace was still holding her coffee and staring out a small porthole window at the dead star outside. That it came as a message in the standard Imperial format, a short, formal text in the common trade language with the Emperor's seal at the top. It said that the Emperor was requesting a secondary audience with the human delegation. It said the audience was scheduled for the 3rd hour of the station's morning cycle. It said that the boy was to be present. Grace read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. Then she put down her coffee, which she no longer wanted, and went to wake up Pete. By the time the message had been translated and confirmed and cross-referenced with the station's protocol office to make sure it was genuine, which it was, the other delegations had begun to hear about it. News on an Imperial station moved the way all confined space news moved, fast, thorough, and with a momentum that made it impossible to stop. The Solari ambassador requested a formal explanation from the station's administrative office and was told that no explanation was available. The Keth coordinator Venhale sent a message to his government's diplomatic corps marked urgent. The Theron delegation held an emergency meeting in their quarters that lasted 2 hours and produced a document nobody could agree on. Danny woke up naturally, ate a bowl of something from the food dispenser that he said tasted like slightly sweet cardboard, but he ate all of it anyway, and put on his cleanest shirt. The throne hall looked different in the morning cycle. The light was still low and the space was still enormous, but there was a quality to the air that felt different from the day before, less like a place where things were being judged and more like a room where someone had decided to stay for a while. Varric was in the same position on his throne. The card was still on the armrest. This time there were no other delegations. There were a few members of the Imperial staff standing at the sides of the hall, figures in dark uniforms who stood very still and watched everything, but otherwise the hall was empty except for the 4 humans. And then Grace saw something that made her stop walking for just a moment before she recovered herself. Beside the Emperor's throne, about 2 meters to the right, there was a chair. It was a plain chair, dark stone, clearly pulled from somewhere else and placed there deliberately. It was sized for a human adult but positioned at a height that suggested whoever put it there had thought about the fact that a 10-year-old would be sitting in it and had added something underneath, a flat raised platform, so that the person sitting would be at a level where a conversation was possible. No one had ever been given a chair beside the Emperor's throne. There was no record of it. Later, when the Imperial historians tried to find a precedent, they would go back over 3,000 years of records and find nothing. Danny saw the chair and looked at Grace with a small questioning expression. Grace gave him the smallest nod she could manage. He walked over and sat down, dropping his backpack by his feet and placing his hands on his knees. What followed was not what Grace had expected. She had prepared for another formal exchange. She had her notes. She had a list of topics relevant to humanity's diplomatic position, a set of carefully worded requests, a structure for how a successful conversation might go. The Emperor did not ask about any of it that he asked Danny about Earth. He asked what it looked like, what the seasons were like, whether the oceans were warm or cold. Danny told him about the one time his school took a trip to the coast and how the ocean was so big that he could not see the end of it and how the water was so cold it hurt your feet but you kept going in anyway because it was worth it. The Emperor asked about the orphanage. Danny told him about it matter-of-factly, the way he talked about most things, not as something sad, exactly, but as something real. He said it was okay. He said some of the other kids were annoying but mostly good. He said the food was better than the food on the Imperial station, which made one of the Imperial staff at the side of the hall make a very small, quickly suppressed noise. The Emperor asked about the colored pencils. Danny pulled out his tin and showed him. He explained which colors he used most and which ones wore down fastest and how the silver was almost gone because he used it for stars and water and windows. Then Danny asked the Emperor questions that he asked what was the oldest thing the Emperor had ever seen. The Emperor told him about a star that had been dying when he was still young, a process that took 800 years and that he had watched through every stage until the very end, when it collapsed into something dense and absolute and quiet. Danny asked if it was sad to watch and the Emperor said that at the time he had not thought of it as sad. He said he was not sure what he had thought of it as, but that he still remembered the exact color of the last light it gave off, which was a particular shade of deep red that he had not seen since. Danny said that sounded kind of sad but also kind of beautiful, and the Emperor said that was a fair description. Danny asked if the Emperor got lonely. There was a long pause. The Emperor said that loneliness was not a word he had thought about in a very long time. He said that when you lived long enough, you stopped expecting company and started thinking of solitude as the natural condition of things. Danny said that didn't sound very good, and the Emperor said it was simply what was. Then Danny asked the question that he asked, why the Emperor always said no to gifts. The hall was very quiet. Grace's pen had stopped moving over her notepad. The Emperor looked at the card on his armrest. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to say something true. Everything that has ever been given to me, he said slowly, has been given because someone needed something from me. The gift was never the point. The point was always what came after it. What was being asked for? He paused. No one has ever given me anything simply because they wished to. Danny thought about this for a few seconds. I didn't need anything, he said. I just thought you seemed like someone who doesn't get many thank you cards. You said that yesterday. The Emperor said. It's still true, Danny said. Another silence. Longer this time, but not uncomfortable. before the delegation left, the Emperor made a formal declaration before the assembled Imperial staff. His voice carried through the hall with complete clarity, each word deliberate and final in the way that only words spoken by someone who has watched civilizations rise and fall can be final. Humanity was to be granted protected status under Imperial law. All human colony worlds and vessels were to receive the protections afforded to recognized member species of the Empire. Trading rights were to be extended across all affiliated systems immediately. A permanent diplomatic channel to the Imperial throne itself was to be established, not addressed to any government or office, but extended to the human people as a whole. The Imperial staff recorded every word without expression. They had been trained for this. Grace recorded every word too, with shaking hands, in handwriting that she would later look back at and barely recognize as her own. The change did not happen all at once. That was not how things worked on a galactic scale, where distances were so large that news traveled in weeks and consequences arrived in months or years. But it happened. Within 60 days, 3 different species that had previously avoided human trade routes made contact with the human diplomatic corps. They were polite, careful, and very clearly operating on the assumption that humanity now had a relationship with the Emperor that they did not fully understand but were unwilling to ignore. The tone of every message was the same, cautious, interested, watching to see what this meant. Within 6 months, the raids on 2 outer colony worlds stopped. No explanation was given. The ships that had been conducting the raids simply did not return. The colonies sent messages of confused relief and the diplomatic corps sent careful thank you notes to parties they were not entirely sure had been responsible. Within a year, humanity's position in the known galaxy had shifted so fundamentally that the senior diplomatic staff back home ran out of words to describe it accurately and had to invent new ones. Grace Holloway became the most decorated diplomat in human history. She gave interviews, attended ceremonies, received awards, and in every single one of them she said the same thing when asked what she had done to bring about the change. She said she had not done it. Reporters assumed this was modesty. It was not modesty. It was the literal truth, and she said it with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a woman who had witnessed something she still did not entirely understand. Pete Dunbar wrote a memoir. It was called something involving the phrase, the card, and it sold extremely well, which he found baffling because he said he had mostly just stood there breathing. Leon Voss returned to a teaching post at a small university in the Pacific Northwest and taught a course on alien diplomatic protocol that became unexpectedly popular, largely because he spent the first lecture simply telling students what the inside of the Emperor's throne hall smelled like and how large the doors were. The alien delegations that had been present at the station wrote their own accounts. The Keth coordinator Van Hale filed a report to his government that was 40 pages long and concluded with a recommendation that all future diplomatic training include a module on what he called the human anomaly, by which he meant the specific and apparently reliable tendency of humans to behave in ways that no predictive model anticipated. The Solari published a philosophical paper arguing that the event represented a fundamental challenge to their existing understanding of how value was assigned to objects and gestures. The Theran did not publish anything but were observed to have quietly begun learning more about human customs, which for a species as proud as the Theran was considered extraordinary by everyone who noticed. Danny Colt grew up. He grew up in the ordinary way that people do, slowly, unevenly, with periods of being entirely certain about everything followed by periods of being certain about nothing. Grace formally adopted him when he was 11. He was a decent student, good at drawing and surprisingly good at languages, not because he was a prodigy but because he genuinely liked the way different languages felt in his mouth, the shapes of words from other worlds, the way you could understand something in one language that had no translation in another. He saw the stars up close for the first time when he was 16, on a school trip to a small orbital station. He stood at a viewport for a long time looking at them. They were not pointy. They were sharp and clean and very still, more like holes in fabric than like the things he had drawn as a child. He thought about what the Emperor had said about the last light of the dying star, deep red, a color not seen since. He wondered if any color was ever really gone or just waiting to appear somewhere new. He became, eventually, an explorer. Then a first contact specialist. It turned out that the thing he had done in the Emperor's throne hall when he was 10 years old was not an accident and was not simply the innocent behavior of a child who didn't know any better. It was a skill, a specific, learnable, deeply uncommon skill that had a name in the diplomatic corps: unguarded sincerity. The ability to be present with someone, to offer something real, and to ask questions without fear of the answers. That he was very good at it. That he was asked about the card often, throughout his life, in interviews and lectures and quiet conversations on ships crossing distances that took months to cross. He always gave the same answer, not because he had rehearsed it but because it was simply true. He said that his parents had always told him to say thank you when someone did something for you. He said that the emperor had let them come to his station when he didn't have to, and that seemed worth thanking him for. He said he thought the emperor seemed like someone who had not heard that in a while. That he said he had not expected anything to happen. He had just thought it was the right thing to do. The card itself became, in time, an object of remarkable documented history. It appeared in the Imperial archives under a registration number that put it alongside relics from civilizations that had not existed for over 1,000 years. Scholars from 6 different species attempted to study it. They analyzed its material composition, which was ordinary paper and ordinary wax-based colored pencil. They wrote papers about its symbolic meaning. They constructed elaborate theoretical frameworks about why it had succeeded where crowns and planets and living arc ships had not. The best answer any of them arrived at was also the simplest one: every other gift had been an argument. The card had just been a card, somewhere in the heart of the oldest station in the known galaxy, in a room that very few people had ever seen. The card sat behind protective glass in a case that had been built for it by Imperial craftsmen who were accustomed to working with ancient and precious things. The corner was still slightly bent. The stars were still not quite right, 6-pointed, uneven, drawn by a boy who had not yet seen them up close and imagined them as something trying to be noticed. That it was the only gift in 3,000 years that had never been returned, and if you looked very carefully at the stars the boy had drawn, which scholars and diplomats and historians did, many times, with instruments far more precise than a child's good intentions, they all pointed slightly outward, away from the center of the card. As if they were reaching in every direction at once. As if they were, in fact, trying to be noticed. As if that, in the end, was enough.